Frontline is a presentation of the Documentary Consortium.
Tonight on Frontline, a critical essay on the Japanese challenge to American business.
If you're an American business in a high-tech industry competing with the Japanese, you are in the business of going out of business.
Some critics say Japanese companies are practicing predatory capitalism. Others argue they're only beating us at our own game.
We need a desert storm from American industry.
Tonight on Frontline, losing the war with Japan.
With funding provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This is Frontline.
Good evening. I'm Robert Krulwich. Earlier this month, President Bush canceled a trip to Japan and the Far East to concentrate his attention on what's happening here at home. Ironically, one of the purposes of that trip was to discuss trade policy with the Japanese, a trade policy that some believe is causing many of the problems we Americans face at home. According to the people that you will meet in tonight's report, Japan is mounting a carefully orchestrated attack on American industry, driving many American companies out of business and driving many Americans out of good jobs. It's an attack, say these experts, that few Americans understand, but they warn the ramifications for all of us are profound. Later, I will be joined by three guests who offer some contrasting points of view, but first, tonight's film is called Losing the War with Japan. It is produced and reported by Martin Kewen.
Fourth of July in the year of Desert Storm. The celebration America had been waiting for since Vietnam. The loudest applause this day was for the heroes of the Gulf War, the men and women who proved what everyone knew in their hearts, that Americans and American technology can't be beat, that America is still number one. But the victory in the Gulf helped disguise a disturbing fact about American power. The United States has been fighting another war, a war it wasn't ready for, a war that it is losing.
The Gulf War was showing off our smart bombs in order to disguise our dumb VCRs.
Professor Chalmers Johnson from the University of California, San Diego, studies Japanese business.
We've been fighting against Karl Marx since the late 1940s. We got Karl Marx. He's dead. But some guys that weren't playing that game have blindsided both of us. I mean, the Cold War is over and Japan won.
特に沖縄から来た石はちょうどペリーの乗ってる船で、あれがケネディ芸術文化センターです。ワシントン DC が政治経済ばかりでなく、
Japan's success has made the Japanese America's wealthiest foreign visitors. They spend 7 times more than the average tourist. But what do they buy? This is the Capitol Boutique, a store just 2 blocks from the White House. Luke Sakaguchi opened it a year ago. The clientele is almost entirely Japanese tourists.
This is a Japanese custom. Whoever go abroad, we must buy souvenir. Not a cheap one, nice one. Unfortunately, the people have only half an hour. It's a panic. It's a war.
The buying frenzy at the Capitol Boutique suggests one reason for the growing tension over the trade deficit with Japan. Japanese may visit America, but they don't buy American.
I see all these are imported goods, huh?
We have also the American goods as well, but unfortunately we don't see many Americans. Jeans, you make a nice jean. We have a beautiful t-shirt from America.
To most Japanese, made in America simply means cheap.
If you make a better one, we like to buy, yes. Yes, but we just cannot find it, you see. Yes.
If Japanese don't want to buy American, Americans are not reluctant to buy Japanese. 1 out of every 3 cars sold in America is Japanese. And that, along with the recession, spells big trouble for U.S. automakers. Chrysler Corporation has already lost more than $1 billion this year, and the trouble is likely to get much worse.
We believe in open markets. We believe in free trade.
Lee Iacocca is the chairman of Chrysler.
But the world has changed. There are a lot of guys that aren't playing by those rules, and we're getting our head handed to us. We're getting clobbered.
When automakers have trouble, so do the suppliers of steel, textiles, plastics, rubber, every basic industry in America. As the American car industry shrinks, auto parts makers must sell to other automakers. The most important are the Japanese.
We build fantastic parts that we sell all over the world. The U.S. sells $15 billion in auto parts to Germany, sophisticated countries, France, Italy. We can't sell any in Japan. They say that, well, they claim our quality and costs aren't good enough. Well, if they're good enough for Mercedes, why in the hell aren't they good enough for Toyota?
Early this year, Iacocca, along with the chairman of GM and Ford, went to the White House to ask for help against what they call unfair Japanese competition. Roger Porter is assistant to the president for economic and domestic policy.
The administration has no plans to assist a particular firm in any industry, whether it's Chrysler or anyone else.
In Washington, the guiding principle that shapes national economic policy is the separation of business and government. At the White House, it is close to a state religion. The administration believes that American business can fight foreign competition alone.
We have a history in this country of dynamic American entrepreneurs. It is something that I hope we never lose in this country. America is and has been, and I hope will always remain, a frontier of opportunity.
There was a time when American cars were the envy of the world. But today, the reputation for quality and reliability in the world market belongs to Japanese cars. The change represents the triumph of Japan's national industrial policy, which mandates that business and government work together for national objectives. For an American businessman facing Japanese competition, the results can be devastating. Al Pace found out the hard way.
They're working to a script we're not. We're an event and they're a blueprint. That's the difference between the two.
We're an event and they're a blueprint?
Certainly.
Al Pace was the president and owner of Variety Stamping, a supplier of auto parts to General Motors for 50 years. It was very much a family business. Wife Betty handled the books. Daughter Diane was the computer operator. Son Mark supervised production. They worked together every day until 2 years ago, when everything fell apart.
It's something I don't enjoy reliving. It just went from bad to worse. He had the hardest time. I mean, I think it all hit him. He just lost a part of himself. We all did, but more so Al, because that was his American dream.
I was born in Cleveland, educated in Cleveland, invested my money and my energy in Cleveland, and the proudest thing I did was that I employed Cleveland people. We had a reputation as a trouble-free source. We were the kind of people that you went to, and if we said it would be there, it was there.
Al Pace built Variety Stamping into a $25 million company with over 200 jobs. But there was a problem. General Motors' business was starting to shrink. If Variety was to keep growing, it would have to make parts for the only expanding market, the Japanese automakers who were building new plants across the Midwest. Al Pace went on the offensive. He even made a video in Japanese.
バラエティスタンピングコーポレーションのご案内を申し上げます。私が社長のアル・ペイスです。
It seemed to work. Honda Motor Company was under pressure to buy American parts for its new factory in Marysville, Ohio. Variety was offered a big contract from Honda, with one catch. They would share the project with a Japanese partner, Kikuchi.
We were awarded the programs, and we had quoted the tools, but we weren't given the opportunity of building the tools. The statement was that they just didn't feel that American suppliers would be capable of delivering the tools on a timely basis. So the tooling was awarded to Kikuchi, my partner from Japan.
So you bought the tools from your partner?
That's correct.
I truly believe that we were being set up, that there was no intention ever to make Al their partner, and that there was no intention of having a long-term relationship with Variety.
Jim Gales supervised the Honda contract at Variety. He says the tools supplied by Kikuchi were defective. The result? Production delays and bad parts. Gale believes Kikuchi had good reason not to try.
Kikuchi actually could be construed as a competitor of ours. In Japan, we're making the same parts that we were making here. When I found out that we were also paying them a royalty for technical assistance, I was really stunned. Absolutely couldn't believe it.
Kikuchi was not just any competitor, but part of Honda's corporate family, or keiretsu. Like other Japanese industrial giants, Honda is actually a complex web of companies that hold shares in one another. Like cartels, keiretsus set prices and control profits to ensure the health of their members. Buying from a keiretsu partner ultimately means lower cost, since Honda gets to share in Kikuchi's profits.
I think that it is expected that variety stamping would fail under these circumstances. That is, the kinds of incentives, the kinds of institutional requirements that variety stamping faces compared with the Japanese requirements means that they are going to fail.
When the tools supplied by Kikuchi broke down, engineers were sent from Japan to repair them. They did not speak English. Production slowed and costs soared.
Our partner supplied us the weld systems, which did not make acceptable welds. We had components supplied to us by Japan that, when put together, did not create an acceptable product.
Even when Honda inspectors approved parts at Variety, other inspectors would often reject them when they arrived in Marysville. In a matter of months, Variety's stamping collapsed.
I think that they wanted their own company producing these parts. I think they wanted to go through the motions of saying that, yes, we tried an American supplier, and they could not give us the quality that we needed.
So they were building a case against Variety?
I believe that's exactly what they were doing.
Frontline repeatedly offered Honda an opportunity to respond. Honda refused. There is growing evidence Honda's claim that its cars produced in Ohio are American-made is not true. All of the most expensive or value-added parts are imported from Japan. In fact, when the Customs Department inspected a Marysville Honda engine, it found only 1% of the parts were made by American suppliers.
The more value-added parts would come from Japan. We would, at that point, be the assemblers. We would take the low-end, no-brainer part of it, if you will, and do that.
Just piece the parts together?
Piece the parts together, sell our labor.
And that became an American part?
And that then is, to Honda, an American part, sure.
Auto parts are now the fastest-growing Japanese import. Critics charge Honda and other Japanese transplants have made only token efforts to use American suppliers. Al Pace believes Honda deliberately misled him. And he said, this is the proof. A brand new assembly plant built for Kikuchi by Honda near Marysville. Pace was told Variety would be a partner in this joint venture, but the only partners were Japanese. Al Pace learned the news from a trade magazine.
A $60 million facility. Finding out from the back page of Automotive News rather than your partner does lead you to suspect that perhaps the relationship wasn't as open and above board as it could have been.
Al took it upon himself to try and fix everything and to try and make it right. for his partner, Honda.
Al Pace took them on their word.
Al Pace took them on their word.
And what happened?
Al Pace is out of business today.
American auto parts makers are going out of business at a rate of 1 every 16 hours. One reason, say critics, is that Japanese automakers practice predatory capitalism. The objective is not just to win, but to drive your competition out of business.
We have not found one company yet, one Fortune 500 company, that wasn't under attack in some shape or form.
By the Japanese?
By the Japanese.
Michael Socorro was once a senior analyst at the Pentagon. He was the head of Project Socrates, a classified program in the Defense Intelligence Agency. The objective of Project Socrates was to identify and protect technologies critical to national security. Socorro's research revealed that the Japanese practice capitalism with military discipline.
If you look at some of the strategies, the way they're written up by the Japanese, they don't talk about we're going to go over and get a bigger market. They talk about frontal attacks, flanking attacks. They talk about totally envelopment strategies, which means you take the customer and you totally surround him with interlocking technologies, such that whatever direction he turns, he's got to use one of their technologies in order to satisfy his needs.
Sounds like war almost.
It is war.
Project Socrates was designed to ensure that America's most advanced weapon systems did not depend on foreign-made components. But when the Bush administration took office, Project Socrates was shut down. The president's advisors dismissed it as industrial policy, a violation of free market ideology.
Did anyone from the administration ask you why your program was important?
No, we had no discussions with the administration.
So why was it ended without discussion?
I don't know.
Advanced electronics helped win the Gulf War, everything from navigation systems to smart bombs. But it was not just American technology. Many of the most critical components were made in Japan. If Washington does not have an industrial policy, Findlay, Ohio does. In Japan, it's known as Friendly Findlay.
Mr. Suzuki, how are you, my friend?
Even the word Ohio means good morning in Japanese, and the state is working hard to live up to its name. Ohio and other industrial states are actively courting Japanese investment, and the Japanese companies prefer rural towns like Findlay, predominantly white communities without unions. GSW Manufacturing came to Findlay from Japan 2 years ago. The company assembles electrical wiring for automobiles. GSW is a subsidiary of Shinsei Harness Company, a Toyota supplier. The factory is in a foreign trade zone set up by the state, so parts and materials can be imported duty-free. To Findlay's Mayor Keith Romick, the arrival of the Japanese is good news.
And the positive attitude you have towards the city of Findlay. I think it's great. I think you're great salespeople for the city. Thank you.
But leaving industrial policy to the mayor of towns like Findlay has been bad news for the American auto industry nationwide.
The Japanese automotive industry trumpets the fact that they have created 98,000 new jobs at transplant facilities and related facilities in the United States. It's marvelous. The only difficulty is, in the same period of time, the American auto industry lost 500,000 jobs. So there has been no net gain in automotive employment. There has been a 400,000 job decline in that industry.
My name is Larry Crosby. I worked at Dana Corporation for 28 years.
City Auto Stamping for 3 years.
Dura Corporation for 7 years.
Champion Spark Plug for 20 and a half years.
Dura Corporation, 8 years.
For every auto worker who gets laid off, 2 auto parts workers lose their jobs.
For Dura for 7.5 years.
Job prospects are poor for these auto parts workers in Toledo, Ohio. Their traditional customers, the big three, are cutting back, and there's little chance they'll get jobs with the Japanese transplants. 7 Japanese automakers built plants in the Midwest. They were quickly followed by their Japanese suppliers. 6 years ago, there were only 24 Japanese auto parts suppliers in America. By next year, there will be nearly 300. It is no accident. The migration was encouraged by the industrial policy of the Japanese government.
We claim to not have industrial policy, but every state in the Union has an industrial policy, and it is to screw other states.
What's the implications of that?
Well, it seems to me that this gives the Japanese a tremendous opportunity to play one state off against the other.
They go over and they say, look, I got tax money, I can give you $200 million, come locate, because I've got to worry in my state about jobs. Why do these individual states compete with each other to get jobs, but the U.S. in total doesn't worry about jobs? See, Michigan has an industrial policy. These states have an industrial policy, but the U.S. says, oh, no, that gets in the way of our ideology.
To convince Honda to locate in Ohio, the state gave Honda incentives worth over $60 million to build its Marysville complex. As part of the deal, Honda won't have to pay property taxes for 15 years. The Marysville plant led the boom in Honda's U.S. sales that has permanently changed the shape of the industry. Today, in American passenger car sales, the big three are GM, Ford, and Honda.
They go into a cornfield. They don't go into any ghettos. They don't want any of the problems, okay? And what do? They have young people, farm boys they bring in. They're healthy. They don't use health care. They won't have a pension problem for 20 to 25 years because they're so young. You take those two loads, you say, well, why don't you do that? Why don't you wipe out all your plants and start over again? No, wait a minute. I got a workforce in downtown Detroit. I'm putting $1 billion in that. Japanese would never do that. But at some point, you got to weigh what your obligations are to your company, to your cities, states, to society. Japanese come in clean and say, no, we're not going to buy your problems. We're going over here.
Chrysler's problems are real, and their implications ominous. The company is saddled with old factories in inner cities. The average age of its workers is over 40. And at a time when losses are mounting, Chrysler owes its workers' pension fund over $3 billion.
If all the jobs go, the tax base erodes. Forget making a buck and eating and sleeping well. Who's going to take care of the roads and the environment? Who pays for all this stuff if there's nothing left to tax? That's why any country who doesn't protect its industrial base is crazy.
Yeah, I've mostly been looking for a job, right? There's not enough jobs for everybody laid off in the city of Toledo.
I have a house note, car payments, insurance. At this moment, no health benefits. If I get sick, goodbye. That's it.
The loss in tax revenue multiplies. Unemployed workers pay few taxes. They require social services. And the Japanese transplants export most of their profits and taxes to Japan.
If we need all these stereos and VCRs and cars and motorcycles and snowmobiles and everything else that we're buying that's made in other countries, if it was made right here, we'd all be working and we'd all be getting a dignified income.
All your hatch releases are here for your back. This is for your headlight covers. Power mirrors in the door. You elect the side, right or left. This is for your fog lights. The next circle dial behind you is temperature control. Blue is cold, red is hot.
Christina Schindeldecker is buying a new car. She's unhappy with her old one, a Plymouth from Chrysler.
My dad told me a lot about Japanese cars. He said that they're made very well.
She's decided to buy a Mitsubishi Eclipse.
How'd you like that?
Oh, it's great.
Isn't that a nice car?
Very nice. Very nice.
But sometimes the difference between Japanese and American cars is less than consumers think. In fact, the Mitsubishi Eclipse is identical to this car, the Plymouth Laser. They're both manufactured in the same factory in Illinois. Yet in America, the Mitsubishi Eclipse outsells the Plymouth Laser 2-1. Consumer demand for Japanese cars, built in modern factories subsidized by state tax incentives, is accelerating the decline of the U.S. auto industry and the jobs that depend on it.
The states are unfortunately engaging in self-destructive competition.
Clyde Prestowitz is a former Commerce Department official and an expert on Japanese business.
they are being played off one against the other. And they are, in a sense, subsidizing the destruction of a large part of the U.S. auto and auto parts industry.
Do the Japanese think we're fools?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I can't tell you how many times Japanese from the government, Japanese from academia, Japanese from industry say to me, Prestowitz-san, don't you Americans know what's happening to you? And it's not just Japanese. I've had the same comment from Koreans, from Singaporeans, from Hong Kong Chinese, from Taiwanese, from Frenchmen, from Germans. The rest of the world thinks we are absolutely nuts.
Let me underscore that this is a public, informal hearing, which is not...
The world finds U.S. trade policy a bit crazy because it gives American business few weapons to fight the trade war with Japan.
Without fair pricing in the marketplace, the industry will not fulfill its potential. Indeed, it may not survive its infancy.
The petitioners at this Commerce Department hearing know how tough a fight it can be. They claim Japanese dumping or selling below cost destroyed their industry. They represent the last remaining U.S. manufacturers of flat panel display screens, which are most commonly used in laptop computers. But the future possibilities are vast.
There are many areas into which this technology will go. It's not just computers. We're going to have flat panel displays for our television sets. We're going to have flat panel displays in our automobiles. Radar screens in control towers and in aircraft are going to be flat panel displays. Medical imaging is going to be flat panel display. It's going to be a pervasive technology. Dominance of that flat panel display technology is going to be a big step towards achieving dominance in laptop computers, television sets, radar displays, automobile displays, medical displays, and so forth.
So this is a critical component we're talking about.
It's a very important component.
This is a very difficult case and a very critical industry.
The flat panel case is in its 11th month of hearings, economic studies, and legal briefs. It is a slow process.
On page F3, under the listing property and equipment net,
the business of dumping is highly technical. Few understand the mechanics, and even those who do often have trouble defining the terms.
So you accept the concept of partial BIA.
Proof is often difficult to obtain, and every point subject to endless interpretation.
In order to go into a yield calculation, the material has to go through the end of the process.
While the hearings and appeals drag on, the dumping and the damage continue. The technology was invented by American companies 30 years ago, but it was Japanese companies, with the support of their government, that spent the billions necessary to create the industry. The Japanese now control 90% of the market. They are charged with selling their screens for as little as 1/3 what it costs to make them, and they have spared no expense defending against the charges.
She will add the electronics to it.
We estimate that the Japanese spent more at one hearing than we have budgeted for our entire case.
For the whole case?
For the entire case. I would say probably we're going to be outspent about 100 to 1.
If there is a pool effort, and this, of course, we have seen in the camera industry, we have seen it in the home electronics industry, we've seen it in the car industry. If there is a concerted effort for international market share, Japanese large corporations are virtually unbeatable.
Karel van Wolferen is a Dutch business journalist who lives in Japan.
Since large Japanese corporations do not go bankrupt, it means they can always, in their campaigns for market share, outcompete everybody else. They'll always win. It means that American or European companies cannot really compete.
Is there going to be a thing that was going to block the ball?
Oh, good shot, El.
Jim Hurd is a classic American success story. 8 years ago, he saw the opportunity to create a new product. He founded Planar Systems of Beaverton, Oregon. Now the nation's largest maker of flat panel displays. Hurd wants to compete for the booming laptop computer market. Yet despite Planar's success, he can't find investors.
If you're an entrepreneur trying to raise money for a company that is going to take on the Japanese or compete with the Japanese in one of their targeted markets, you won't raise money.
What you're saying is that the capital markets believe that if you're going against Japanese competition, you don't have a prayer.
Absolutely.
Planar manufactures highly specialized screens for the Department of Defense. To enter the consumer market, Planar would have to invest $100 million in new facilities, but the numbers just don't add up.
Can we sell this particular display at the prices that we had laid out? And so
at the current market price, Planar would lose money on every screen. A disaster for an American company, but not for a Japanese company in a target industry.
When Americans ask, is Hitachi making a profit on semiconductors? You always want to say to them, even if we had the information, you've asked the wrong question. Hitachi doesn't care. They're carrying semiconductors because it's the industry of the future. It's an industry they know they have to be in, and they're going to be in it.
The greatest pressure on them is format change versus performance enhancement.
To Jim Hurd, Japan's low-price strategy has a single objective: to ensure that no one can make a competing product and stay in business.
The Japanese, contrary to popular opinion, don't have any interest in losing money. So what they want to do, the strategy is very clear. You want to go into these markets. You want to drive competition out. You want to come down the cost curve as fast as possible. But as soon as the competition is gone and the users of the displays have no choice, the price goes up.
As it stands right now, if you're an American business in a high-tech industry competing with the Japanese, you are in the business of going out of business.
The department should use the best information available.
The Department of Commerce found the Japanese guilty of dumping flat panel displays. But for Jim Hurd, the fight is not over. He must now go to another federal agency and prove the dumping actually hurt his business.
Oh, great.
I welcome you to this hearing on behalf of the U.S. International Trade Commission. The hearing is on investigation number 731, TA 469, final involving high information content, flat panel displays, and sub-assemblies thereof from Japan.
The final chapter of the flat panel case. It has taken 1 year.
The purpose of the investigation is to determine whether an industry in the United States is materially injured or is threatened with material injury.
Jim Hurd and his fellow entrepreneurs are facing new opposition. Only this time, the opponents are not Japanese.
If you don't have the right technology, you're not going to make my cut. And if you don't have the ability to produce that in volume so I can make some money out of it, then you won't make that cut.
American computer companies buy their flat panels from Japan. They claim the Americans don't make the products they need.
Our experience in sourcing flat panels from the U.S. has been a series of dead ends.
But Jim Hurd claims companies like IBM, Apple, and Compaq had a chance to buy American.
No company, Japanese or American, had those displays readily available at all. They were all new developmental items that had to be developed for those applications. U.S. companies were every bit as capable of developing those products as Japanese companies.
The motive, says Hurd, was profit. The Japanese promised to supply huge quantities of laptop screens to American computer companies at half what it cost to make them.
Indeed, if you're an American consumer, it is a good buy in the short term.
In the long term?
In the long term, it's probably a disaster.
The same Japanese companies that make these flat panel displays also make computers. So the U.S. computer companies have become dependent on some of their major competitors for key components of their own products.
It can get to the point where the American company is dependent upon the Japanese technology, and therefore the Japanese can dictate terms to the Americans on what they will and will not do.
They can cut off their supply.
That's right, cut off their supply. And if the United States, does not have the technology, then they can't make the products.
The companies that we once thought were great manufacturing companies, IBMs, Compaqs, Apples, are really very much hollowed out compared to what they were. They are now really repackagers or assemblers.
Seeking short-term profits from dump components, the U.S. portable computer manufacturers have all ended up buying components from the same Japanese suppliers. Look on the back of Compact's flagship model LTE 386. It proudly proclaims, assembled in the USA.
When Jim Hurd made his case to the International Trade Commission, the room was filled with over 30 top Washington trade attorneys. Nearly half once held senior positions in the U.S. government. All were working for the Japanese.
Japanese call it putting an American face on Japan's position. The Japan lobby is literally able to dominate politically virtually any issue that it chooses to take on.
Pat Choate is an author who has written extensively about the Japan lobby.
Since 1972, 1/2 of our trade negotiators have become foreign agents after they left office. What we find today is that most of these officials are literally planning on becoming foreign agents when they go in to the position. Their public position is a way for them to develop a client list.
To defend their position at this hearing, the Japanese hired former officials of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the Department of Justice, the Department of Commerce, and the International Trade Commission itself, the ITC.
Certainly you could look at like product and come out differently than Commerce did.
Bill Allberger represents Compact. His treatment at this hearing is uncommonly polite.
Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Very pleasant, thank you.
One reason is that Allberger is on familiar turf. He was once chairman of the ITC.
Commissioner Allberger, with you on the question that Commissioner Rohrer was asking.
Japan's case against the American entrepreneurs is based entirely on the economic analysis of this woman, Paula Stern. Her opinion carries weight here too. She also chaired the ITC.
How do you respond to critics who feel that it's inappropriate for a former ITC chairman like yourself to lobby for foreign firms?
I'm not lobbying. This is a quasi-judicial agency of the U.S. government. I am an expert witness combining my economic and my legal and my capabilities and background. In fact, there are others here, too, who have appeared before me who have been lawyers. I am not a lawyer, but I have administered this law for 9 years, and I have the economic skills and the background in analyzing industries. This is not lobbying.
If a former Japanese government official went through the revolving door as American officials do, that official would become a social leper in Japan. Their family would be ostracized in Japan. And several generations from now, their great-grandchildren would be left to explain why their predecessors did that. It's just enormous social pressure, and it's not done.
We are here to compete. We can only compete worldwide if the U.S. government enforces fair trade laws. Thank you.
Jim Hurd and his fellow entrepreneurs proved Japanese dumping hurt their business. The ITC agreed to impose stiff duties on the Japanese flat panel industry. But the victory may prove meaningless. To avoid the high duties, American computer makers plan to move assembly of laptop computers offshore. The result? Fewer American jobs. The Japanese now exercise nearly total control over the most advanced display technology. A technology that was invented in the U.S., a technology the American computer industry depends on.
The technology which is the center of their ability to actually produce the product is being pulled out right through the back door by their adversaries, and that's what they will use to attack them to push them out of business.
Does all this scare you?
It scares the hell out of me.
Why?
Because I see that at the whole pace of this whole attack, this whole thing, is getting faster and faster. They will continue to get more and more control in the United States. They can call the shots on exactly what the consumer gets, what companies are making the products, and they will have financial control.
Oh, I just blew that sucker up. And kicked their butt.
If the dangers of monopoly control seem far-fetched, consider the case of video games.
We're continuing to maintain our retail sales plan at the $4 billion level. 4.5 million units in hardware, 45 million units in software. The SNES continues to have a unit sales projection through December of 2 million units, with 6 million units of software projected through
The men sitting in this room control the American video game industry. Nintendo, the most successful Japanese company in America by at least one measure. Nintendo controls 85% of the U.S. video game market.
We can't underestimate the value of 60 million players.
And Toys R Us, the world's largest toy retailer.
Are the lion's share of the business facing.
They're meeting to plan for the all-important Christmas season at the annual Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, the most important trade show in the industry.
1, 2, or 5 compete with a satellite force or an MVP technique.
Even in a business known for flash and glitz, the Nintendo exhibit is something special. A $6 million display of pure market power.
Nintendo Entertainment System is the frosting on the cake.
To marketing vice president Peter Main, selling Nintendo is easy.
They come, they try, they like, and they buy, and it's a fun business.
Especially fun if there's no competition. Companies that try to compete with Nintendo have an uphill fight.
When you're the batter, these control moving yourself forward and backward.
Dan Van Elderen is the president of Tengen, one of Nintendo's few competitors. Tengen can't get major retailers like Toys R Us to even carry its products. Van Elderen says Nintendo is the reason.
In a matter of 3 or 4 months, they were able to, one by one, contact all major retailers and convince them or intimidate them or induce them not to handle Tengen product.
Richard Frick is also trying to take on Nintendo. These factory workers in San Jose, California, are manufacturing video games for his company, American Video Entertainment.
We can't match them dollar for dollar, but we can match them game for game.
How many of the top 20 retail toy stores are your products in right now?
None of the top 20
None?
Retail toy stores, none at all.
Richard Frick says you can't buy his games in stores because retailers fear retaliation from Nintendo.
The fear they have of not receiving future products into their stores, which they very much count on for their profits.
Fear that Nintendo will cut them off?
Would cut them off or not ship them or undership them, the products that they need, the new hit products.
What's the response you get from Toys R Us?
Well, they try to be very careful about what they say. They don't want to do anything to get themselves in trouble. And more than anything else, they just say that we're not a vendor that they can deal with at this point in time.
Toys R Us refused Frontline's request for an interview. It's no surprise Toys R Us tries not to offend Nintendo. Competitors claim Nintendo games represent 15% of Toys R Us revenues, but 25% of its profits.
Tapes are kind of expensive, but kids want it, so you got to get it for them.
Parents may wonder why there's almost never a Nintendo sale.
In 6 years, the price hasn't gone down at all. Not at all. Not at all.
But every consumer product I can think of, TVs, VCRs, CDs, the price always goes down.
Oh, I believe that the manufacturing costs of these products have gone down significantly for Nintendo. They've just kept all that money instead of passing it on to the consumer. There's no reason for them to. There's no competition for them.
Richard Frick says he can sell his games for less than $20 and still make a big profit. The Federal Trade Commission recently discovered how Nintendo keeps its prices high.
Nintendo fixed prices with their dealers, wouldn't allow dealers to discount, and as a result, consumers that tried to comparison shop were just wasting their time.
The FTC found Nintendo guilty of price fixing. As part of the settlement, the company agreed to refund up to $25 million to consumers. It will pay the fine by offering $5 discounts for the purchase of future Nintendo products.
Introducing the next generation from Nintendo. It's a bit more exciting, a bit more challenging, a bit more graphic, a bit more colorful, a bit more realistic, a bit more levels, a bit more secrets, a bit more enemies, a bit more friends.
And a lot more expensive. The new improved Nintendo system was introduced to the press this summer. It cost twice as much as the old Nintendo.
Now you're playing with power, superpower.
Do you see that price coming down in the future where these games will not be that expensive?
I'm not certain. There may be some prices below that. There well could be prices above that.
Nintendo of America denied Frontline's request to interview its president, Minoru Arakawa.
I think his English is fine, but I think he's a little bit shy, and I think he would rather have some of his other people conduct the interviews.
Howard Lincoln is senior vice president.
We decided if we could make a video game system with quality games, that we would be successful. We took that gamble, and now I think it's appropriate for us to reap the rewards of that gamble. That is capitalism.
Everything that's on the shelf is made by Nintendo. There's absolutely no competition to make the prices cheaper, and that is one of the reasons why Nintendo is afraid of us, is we have an alternative source of product that's completely legal, that plays well, and they don't want to have any competition at all. That's what a monopoly is all about.
Nintendo doesn't have anything to do with the choice that retailers make as to what products they're going to carry. And there is absolutely no evidence that I'm aware of that Nintendo has kept any of these other companies out of the marketplace.
While Nintendo insists they have done nothing wrong, Frontline has learned of several active federal and state investigations examining evidence that Nintendo has monopolized the video game industry.
The message that's being sent is that if you want to play in the Nintendo world, you need to play by Nintendo's rules. And if you don't want to play by Nintendo's rules, it's going to be a very, very hard struggle.
Ooh, blow up the Apache. Got it. Yeah, I'm blowing up that prison.
Oh, what's that thing? Oh, this.
Nintendo has captured the imagination of America's children. But critics claim its near total control of the market gives it the power to decide what products reach consumers and at what price.
Got it.
It's a matter of the American public having a choice as to what they can and can't do. Suppose Sony decided to take and make all of the Columbia Picture movies compatible only with Sony videotape players. There would be a situation very similar to what Nintendo's trying to do with us.
When you start applying that to movies or books, magazines, TV shows, I think it's very clear how that can be really significant.
It begins to affect what's seen, what's done, what's shown, and we know who's boss. That is to say, if you don't think ownership matters, you're not playing capitalism any longer. And the Japanese would be the owners of these companies.
But you seem to be suggesting that somehow this Japanese ownership could abridge free speech in this country.
Oh, I think no question about it. No question about it. I mean, that is to say, money does talk.
Control of the video game market has given Nintendo the opportunity for immense profit. Its cash reserves alone exceed $1.5 billion. But money is not the only measure.
The reason to be in high-tech industries these days is not to make a profit. The reason to be in high-tech industries is those are good jobs for your people.
At Nintendo of America headquarters in Redmond, Washington, most jobs aren't exactly high-tech. There are no manufacturing jobs. All Nintendo games are made in Japan. The only work here involves loading and unloading trucks.
A nation that doesn't make anything is a nation that has a pretty poor spirit. The United States is increasingly a nation that doesn't make things. And if we are going to pass on to our children the heritage that we received, if we're going to pass on something that's rich and full and growing, the opportunities, the ability to be the nation that we have been for most of our history, we're going to have to produce something.
Any problems yet? No, not yet. Seems to be running pretty smooth.
That's good.
Nintendo of America doesn't produce games, but it does have a research and development group.
We're roasting him.
This is an R&D team at work, only they don't really develop games, they play them. Most of the R&D is done in Japan.
See if you get a second star now.
Nintendo Gameplay, this is Sean. How can I help you? Low G-Man? Mm-hmm.
The largest number of workers are game counselors. They log 150,000 calls a week.
Continue to the right until you get to this real big drop-off. That's when you want to use the umbrella.
Looks like sort of like a balloon with a plus sign on it.
You want to try to shoot for the head.
Well, then you have to go and fight Astos.
If you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, you can walk through the wall. You want to freeze him by hitting him in the head.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but then you want to spear him kind of midway through his body.
All right.
So it kind of cuts him in half, basically.
All right.
Okay?
All right, that's cool.
Is there anything else I can help you with?
No, that'll be all. Thanks a lot.
You got all that then?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, bye.
Thanks for calling.
Dozo. Dozo. Yoroshiku. Yoroshiku. Watashi wa Ohio. Ohio. Ohio.
These inner-city students in Washington, D.C. are learning about Japan. The program, funded partly by a Japanese foundation, is one of thousands of such grassroots educational efforts paid for by the Japanese government and Japanese corporations. The objective is to help shape how young Americans view Japan.
They have a factory in the USA, and many Americans work for that factory. So they are very happy.
The Japanese are investing, at this point, tens of millions of dollars in elementary, secondary, and higher education to make sure that the next generation of Americans think the way about Japan that the Japanese want them to think about Japan.
Dozo yoroshiku. Dozo yoroshiku. And bow.
Japanese philanthropy is seen by most as a gesture of goodwill, but some see it as part of a deliberate campaign to blunt criticism of Japan.
We cannot have an honest discussion about U.S.-Japan relations or our own future because too many people that are participating in the debate are either afraid to be candid, or they have a money interest in advocating the Japanese point of view, or at least not offending them.
Pat Choate is one of those critics labeled a Japan basher.
For a nice brother-sister chat, huh?
Clyde Prestowitz is another. He and his family have lived and worked in Japan.
The term Japan basher is an all-purpose smear word which is used as a McCarthyist tactic to cut off debate. And I detest the word, and I detest its usage.
What do they accomplish by using that label? What's the purpose behind it?
It cuts off debate. If you can pin the term Japan basher on someone, then you have painted him as illegitimate. It means that no one should listen to this person. You don't have to respond to his arguments because obviously he's ill-intentioned.
So what we're going to do now is to dress some of you in one of these yukata here.
Today we're seeing the largest unilateral transfer of wealth that the world has ever experienced from the United States to Japan.
What's the significance of that?
It means that we're going to be a much poorer nation. It means that in the late 1990s, the first part of the 21st century, we're going to have fewer choices. It means a declining standard of living for our children, if not for ourselves.
While critics worry the U.S. is losing the trade war with Japan, the White House remains confident of America's strategy.
If you believe that Americans have the kind of ingenuity and know-how that will allow us to compete with anyone around the world, then you're not fearful of competition. And you are convinced that the American worker and American management and American companies can compete with literally anyone in the world, and that we are going to do it.
Keep your eyes down. Sayonara. One more time. Sayonara.
4th of July in the year of Desert Storm. Celebrations of American supremacy make the economic challenge seem far away.
Come on, guys, open up here.
If critics of U.S. trade policy are right, America is in for some very hard times. Free enterprise means something different in Japan. Al Pace learned that the openness and individualism that are the strengths of American free enterprise can become weaknesses.
No Japanese business is an individual. It's a team. When you talk to a Japanese businessman, you might as well be talking to their government, to their finance ministers in banking, to their trade representatives, to their industry representatives. You're dealing with a plan, a blueprint.
The war for global markets is about more than just jobs. It's about the kind of choices and opportunities there will be for America's children. America won the war in the Gulf. The question is, will America win the economic war that will shape its future?
The American public, the American government is capable of enormous response. Desert Storm is an example of that. We need a Desert Storm from American industry.
Al Pace says we need a desert storm for American industry to meet the Japanese challenge. Well, joining me to discuss Al Pace's remark and the documentary you've just seen are Robert Lawrence, Professor of International Trade and Investment at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, Jim Fallows, Washington editor of the Atlantic Monthly. Mr. Fallows was based in Japan from 1986 to 1989, where he wrote on East Asian affairs, and Dr. Kiichi Mochizuki, a Japanese businessman. He is chairman of the Pacific Institute, a think tank, and former president of Nissin USA, a $4 billion Japanese steel company. Well, let me start with you, Robert Lawrence. You've just seen the film. Do you agree, as the film quite clearly states, that we are at war with Japan and that Japan is a threat to our economy, our industry, and really to all of us?
No, I don't. I think it's a very misleading image to look at economic relations as if they were a war, as if they had a winner and a loser. I think it is quite possible, indeed, in the case of the interaction between Japan and the United States, I believe that we are both winners. I think what this film fails to let us in on is, firstly, that we are also consumers. And it's very clear, indeed it's mentioned in this movie, that Americans are willing to pay a lot more for Japanese cars. The fact is they're building better cars. So we get benefits as consumers that aren't brought out here. I think in addition, given that we prefer these Japanese cars, we are much better off as a nation if they produce those cars in the United States using American labor than we would be if they produced them in Japan. And that's taking place today.
But nothing in the film made you angry? Not the fate of Al Pace? Not the conduct of some of these companies? Not the scenes that you saw?
Well, I do think that the film, for instance, shows us that there is a potential danger of monopoly. The whole story of Nintendo is verified by the fact that our legal authorities have found, made it necessary for them to pay compensation. But I think what else emerged in that Nintendo piece was the fact that, by and large, our consumer electronics industry is run by the Japanese, essentially, and yet we haven't seen monopolistic practices of higher prices. We find declining prices for televisions, declining prices for VCRs. So I think what the film has concentrated on is an exception rather than the rule.
Okay, well, let's turn it over to you. Dr. Mochizuki,
yeah.
You saw the film.
Well, I see a couple of points here. One first, from Japanese point of view, this is sort of one stage of a long dialogue between the two nations. First, trade was a big issue, and people complained about too much export to the United States, and people are losing jobs. And at that time, people wanted investment here.
They had too many goods coming from Japan to America.
From Japan to the United States, thereby U.S. workers losing the jobs. And the demand to correct that situation is to have the investment from Japan to the United States rather than shipping the goods to the United States so that the local jobs will be maintained to produce those goods.
Right.
And Japanese responded to that over the past 20 years and so on. And then there's a problem of the Japanese business practices and so forth, and at least we look different, and their practices, I admit that they're in certain areas they're different, particularly the effort of localization of the invested transplants here should be more vigorously pursued. So that's true.
The localization of the plant?
Of the transplant I used were the Japanese plants here, or the American plants invested by Japanese.
Right.
And
so you were a little bit off-put by the fact that Mr. Pace's...
I think it has to be, this current situation has to be taken in perspective of the long history. And then there's a criticism here for the investment. And then I think Japanese will react to it and improve one by one. I am sure. But it takes a little time. It took a little time for the investment to replace.
What makes you so sure the Japanese conduct will improve one by one?
Because in my mind, at least to my knowledge, and I would like to think I know quite a bit about what's going on there also as well as here, that is, there's no vicious intention or anything, just sheer, honest effort to make business. And yet it's taken differently sometimes because I admit there are certain practice differences. Therefore, this is the time of the process to sort of readjust each other. Japanese has to learn, but the Americans has to learn too that the problem with the economic problems here in the United States, obviously, is not because of the Japanese only, at least. Mm-hmm. There's self-generated problems. A lot of institutions and the pension plans, education, all the systems and so on has become sort of outdated by this time after 30 years, 40 years after the war and so on. Those has to be re-examined and reworked on, including myself, yourself, system, everything else. And plus, this is a new phase for the United States, which collected a lot of immigrants and foreign forces to stimulate the United States throughout the history. And this is the first time that agents, although this is not immigration, the foreign investment here from Japan is a new factor in the history of this country. And this country has grown, and a very special country, because it was able to digest all those new stimuli and digest them and make them into its nutrition. So this is the
digestion problem.
Digest it and make it better for the United States. That's
all right, Jim.
I think the right question to ask after seeing this film is not whether Japanese investment is good or bad, or Japanese trade is good or bad, or either whether Japan is good or bad, but rather to see it as raising questions about a process that has been going on for 10 or 20 years, and that is gradually the shift of assets and technology and industrial power and market share from the U.S. to Japan. Now, this film raises several questions about that process. One is whether it has consequences for America. And I think this film suggests some of the ways in which there are consequences. There are the displacement of people like Al Pace, about whom I know nothing. Maybe he deserves his fate. I don't know. But there are larger numbers of people who are displaced and the loss of certain jobs that were important to America. Certainly, there are benefits to consumers, as Robert pointed out, in having these cars, but life does not run by the lowest VCR price alone. The societies have other things on their mind. So first, it asks us whether this matters, this shift. Second, it raises the question of whether this shift will naturally correct itself. And this is important because implied in most economic logic and in the kind of political logic that the White House representative was expressing is the idea of natural balance. We know that 20 years ago, the French were all upset about America taking over Europe, and that looks silly now. And so this film, however, raises the question that perhaps it will not naturally correct itself. Perhaps
what will not naturally correct?
What I meant was that when the French were upset about the Americans buying up Europe, they seemed to omit the various adaptations that would take place. The IBM in France would have a lot of Frenchmen in it. They would have local supplies, etc. So the worry looks silly now. This film suggests that perhaps it may be different in the case of Japanese investors. They may be slower for various reasons to open themselves up in that way.
In Japan, but it also that we will not reach a nice, friendly, a digestion, as it were, an equilibrium in America without some...
The default state, if you will, the natural extrapolation may be a continuing shift of control over technology and over business decisions from Americans inside America to people outside the borders. And this brings up the third question, which is whether there is something distinctly different about Japan's multinational practices. answer the film suggests is that so far, apparently there is some difference. So far, they may be behaving differently from Dutch firms or German firms. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course. Mr. Mochizuki's own Japanese steel industry was very advanced in localizing, and perhaps the trend will follow his example. But the film suggests that maybe there may be some long-term difference in how the Japanese companies behave.
Well, let's take the first question first. Is there a real difference between American and Japanese business practices that is not resolvable? That there will be no digestion, that there will be no equilibrium, that we will be, in some final sense, at war with winners and losers. You don't think there will be winners and losers in the end, do you?
No, I think there are major differences, and there are major frictions. Actually, I think the most important of these, from an economic standpoint, are not presented in this film, and that has to do with the economic behavior within Japan itself. I think one reason that many people have strong feelings, let's say, about Japanese investment in this country, is the fact that foreign investment in Japan is so small, that Japan itself has been very slow in globalizing as a country. And therefore, we see an America which is open to Japanese investment, and I think it should be, and a Japan which is very closed to foreign investment. Now, I think that we have to have a continuous dialogue. Indeed, we may have to bring a lot of pressure on the Japanese. If they are going to be of this world, some of their institutions may well have to change.
But how long should we wait? Al Pace's fate may be sealed, and then his child may grow up, and Japan's market still may not be open. And at some point you say, forget about it. Now we're going to set up a set of rules to account for this incorrigible behavior.
No, can I get in
Go
there?
ahead. That's what the show seemed to be talking about.
It's going to take some time, and I have my best sympathy for Mr. Pace, and yet the history is such that when you have to change the entire social practices that he's referring to, it will take a long time, and individually, not everyone is having the immediate cure. I'm sorry about it, but I think it has been happening in history, and that doesn't mean that we will delay the effort. We will make the best effort. The Americans have been doing it. Japanese have been doing it. Maybe not quite enough, but we should accelerate the effort. But it will take some time because
it's going to take some time.
Basic.
I don't know what Americans are supposed to do. What answer?
There are a couple suggestions possible, but.
Jim, go ahead.
Let me try to define what this difference is we're talking about. I think the essential difference in the business practices of the two countries is what you could call closedness to newcomers. The Japanese system, as a rule, is difficult for newcomers to enter. This is true on a business sense, where you have familiar partners you deal with. It's true in a national and ethnic sense, too. Japan is essentially closed to non-Japanese people in leadership positions. And I think we'd all agree that this will take some time to correct. The question is what we do in the meantime.
Right.
We all agree we should put pressure on them to change, but should we have policies that assume it will change soon and that will fail if Japan does not transform itself dramatically? Or should we have sort of protective policies that say until Japan does change, we'll have this or that system to try to protect some of our interests?
Well, the greater problem is if we move with policies, let's say, that try to manage trade, that say, look, let's just insist that the Japanese buy X from us.
Yes.
The great problem with those kind of policies is that they could actually be counterproductive. The only way Japan can ensure that it buys a certain amount from us is, in fact, to organize itself in a cartel buying arrangement, which is exactly what we're concerned about in the first place. So I think we do need policies, and we do need to change our policies currently, but we should be very careful that they're compatible with the kind of Japan we're trying to achieve in the end.
Well, you leave me a little hungry for a solution. If we can't... Go ahead.
Let me suggest a couple of things.
Yeah.
I agree with Professor Lawrence in the sense that it shouldn't be a managed trade because it kills the whole thing. It exposes the Americans. That kills the Americans also. So the point is how to fly open their society.
The Japanese society.
Japanese society. SII has been one of the better efforts, I think.
Who?
SII
Structural Impediments Initiative.
Structural Impediments Initiative. What is that?
Yes. That is the government-to-government negotiations about to poke their heads into each other's social and the economic systems to demand to make it more palatable to each other.
Where is the success? This documentary suggests very little in the way of success.
Well, it takes time, and the success has to be obtained by your own effort, making your productivity risen, your product quality better, your education better. American products. If Americans, it's the problem for Americans, and I think it's the problem for Americans.
Well, Jim, I'm just curious. Where do you come out on this?
On this
it seems
point
to me you're close to some kind of managed something.
I think it's important to think clearly about this managed trade issue, because we often discuss it as if it's something that we would never even think about at all, and it has no connection to our current policy. And whereas in fact, a great deal of the trade between the U.S. and Japan is already managed, and in various ways, the automobile export restraints, the semiconductor deals, various agricultural deals. And I think we would come out in a better position for us and for Japan and for our consumers and for the interest of amity between the nations if we thought, yes, this trade is not going to be completely free. We've never had it be completely free. So let's think intelligently how we can use some of these restraints instead of doing it in a kind of stupid backdoor manner, saying, well, our sugar beet farmers are the ones we really have to protect. Let's protect them. If we realized this was inevitable and natural, at least for the foreseeable future, we'd do it in a more careful and sensible way, I think.
Can you give me a smart tidbit?
Well, I think that it is, you mean on the managed trade?
Yeah.
I think it is not, the semiconductor deal, I argue, is not bad for America. I think that saying that the Japanese and American governments expect that American suppliers will get 20% of the Japanese market in a few years, that gives the big Japanese electronics companies a goal of what they have to do. Yes, it will be organized as a cartel, as Robert says, but it's organized in a cartel now. It might as well be a cartel that in the short run we are part of.
Well, let me hear about terrible idea.
Terrible idea.
What we did in the semiconductor market was basically to institute a global cartel. We raised the prices of semiconductors all over the world. And the great American strength, actually, is in computers. And many of our consumer companies who consume those semiconductors have found that the cost of their basic material went up. That's also demonstrated in this film. American government policy forbade now liquid crystal display panels from coming in here at the prices which they were formerly being sold at. And what you saw there was that they dealt a rather major blow to our computer producers. So it seems to me we have to be very careful when we manage.
Let me make sure I understand. You looked at the scene of that fellow, the American who wanted to create those panels, who seemed to be on his last legs. He, I guess, technically wins the legal battle, since there is dumping is found. But are you satisfied that is going to resolve things, that America will have a future by that route, by legalism?
In fact, I think we have terrible dumping laws, that they're written so it is very easy for someone like him to get a positive finding. Right. And I think what that has done is, in fact, to disadvantage the users, just as the semiconductor agreement has disadvantaged the users.
Go ahead, yeah.
The thing here is that there are a lot of businesses and people in the United States who are benefiting from Japanese investment, even at the time of trade. And those are not shown. Those are all sad cases. I am sorry about them. But there are a tremendous number of people who are benefiting
from Americans benefiting who are not in this document.
From Japanese investment. Mm-hmm. And you wanted immediate solution to the problem. And immediate solution.
I'm not asking for immediate. Slower than never.
Short-term solution. But the solution with people's effort has been investment. And invested plants, transplants here. Look, this is American corporation. American plant, okay? But equity is...
Not so fast. How can you say that?
Let me say this. Equity is Japan, okay?
Equity,
but it's incorporated in Japan.
The stock is owned by Japan.
And
Japanese.
Owners are Japanese. But a lot of corporations like that from European equity also. So what is the problem here? The problem is, that's a rhetorical question.
Rhetorical, but excuse me.
The problem here is that the Japanese transplants are here not localized enough in terms of management, in terms of central directions from Tokyo, maybe too much of it. So why don't we think about how to really localize Japanese transplants? That will make it American corporation, just like a Volkswagen in the United States and so on.
Jim, could the Japanese, as they're presently made up, given their natural constitution and their predilection for taking orders from Tokyo and getting things from Tokyo? Could they become localized, like he said, become more Kentuckian or Tennessee?
There are many ways in which people around the world are identical. And one way is they all calculate the cost and the benefits of doing certain things. And there's a different structure of cost and benefits that Japanese executives face, which makes it more tempting for them to remain connected to the Japanese hierarchy than, say, for IBM when it goes overseas. What that means for the U.S. is to change that structure, to put on different requirements in the U.S. Say, if you're going to come here, we expect these following 5 things. And this changes the internal incentive structure for the company.
One suggestion here is to have to make it a law that the certain number of board members of the transplant corporations here should be American citizens.
And you would accept such a rule? Would the Japanese accept such a rule?
Sure.
Well, ask them first.
This is one
and
of the
they might say yes. It's a law.
To interrupt, one of the geniuses of Japan, I think, is its very rapid and successful adaptation to change circumstances. If the circumstances change, I think Japanese corporations will adapt as they have in Europe to stricter rules.
Now, let me ask you, Jim, if let's take the Al Pace case, and let's just imagine that we had Americans on the board, and and so we had, and in fact, Honda was making those products using 95% American-based content. Right. Would that help the Al Pace problem?
That would not help Al Pace personally, but it would certainly change the overall situation, because then, in that matter, corporate ownership doesn't really matter, because you have valuable work being done by Americans in America. So
so let's be clear, because what the film does is it says that if some company is owned by Japanese, or indeed is even in a joint venture between Americans and Japanese, we count that as Japanese. And that's wrong.
Well, you're referring to the hand which holds those parts.
Yes, exactly.
It says there's 1% of the engine is really American.
Yes, and so I think we've got to change that view. We're in a global economy today. And if the workers are American, after all, adding most of the value in America, that's I think where Jim and I would agree, then that's all to the good. There's
so you all think that's seen as a lie in a way?
In fairness, it should be pointed out for symmetry that the Japanese count, say, IBM Japan as an American company. This is not some American trick. If they're going to talk, often if you're talking about semiconductor sales in Japan, they'll count Texas Instruments in Oita or wherever it is in Kyushu as being an American company because it's owned by the U.S. So this is not just an American peculiarity.
But the question comes to laws. Jim would like there to be a law, let's say, that we should put a certain number of Americans on the boards of those companies.
So would he?
Now, okay, both of them. The question is, should we then agree? America has companies all over the world, right? And in a sense, let's remember that we are the biggest foreign investors. Right. That this experience that is being pointed out of receiving foreign investment may be unique to the United States in the 1980s. But the rest of the world has had that experience from American companies for the last 30 years, and I don't think that they have viewed it as losing a war.
But they certainly have applied restrictions. In almost every foreign country where I've lived, there have been local hire rules, local content rules, local board of director rules. Again, this is something in Japan, certainly there have been very strict joint venture type rules for American firms.
Robert, you are in trouble here. You got the Japanese guy saying that he would take rules, and you have him saying he would make rules, and you would not make any of these rules.
Firstly, I don't think it's as yet necessary, because I do see in the Japanese plans themselves a program which is being implemented to increase the American content. I would monitor that.
Point here, though,
But so far, you see, I think what Honda USA wants to be is a good corporate citizen. That is what it wants above all else. And so I don't think it's necessary, really, to get involved in the decisions of those firms, because I think quite naturally what is taking place is that those firms themselves are worrying about their image.
Maybe he's correct. But the point here is not to get the consensus on one specific measure. There may be a lot of cases possible, but the point here is to find specific, constructive, concrete measures to make Japanese investment here acceptable to people rather than going emotional. And I'm presenting this case as possibility that you can find those things. People here are not stupid. You can find something like that.
There are rules that you could put in place that would work, that would solve some of these problems.
So let's work on it rather than emotionally outbursting.
But I have a broader question to ask you, which is that the documentary seems to say that in some very fundamental way, Japanese ownership robs America of its wealth, just by the fact of Japanese ownership.
I don't want to get into the bookkeeping of the corporations, but there are such things, cash flow versus profit. When you talk about cash flow comes a lot at the beginning of the investment, regardless of the negative profit.
Well, are Japanese companies making big profits now on their American investments?
Not many, but some are, and some are losing money. And then when it comes to profit transfer to Japan, don't insult your Internal Revenue Service. They have a good checking on the transfer pricing, and it's not happening. And when it happens, they have a very good means with which to check that.
Is America getting poorer in this relationship?
The question is not whether Japanese ownership makes us poor, because that's certainly not the case. There has been a process underway for several decades, which in net is making us poor. For various reasons, a process significantly involving Japan, which has made the U.S. relatively less powerful economically than it might ideally be. So that is the process to focus on and what we can do to improve it.
But I don't understand. People come here and they buy buy things in the United States. They buy land. Okay, they drive the price up when they buy that land. Okay, they then come and they invest and they build factories here, and they transfer technology to the United States. They have taught us. If you go through the U.S. auto industry today, you will discover an industry which is being remade in the image of the Japanese industry, not by Japanese.
They collect the rents, and they do the design, and they get the best jobs, and they don't give them to us, is the sense of the documentary.
That's right. And I think all of those are inaccurate, okay? Firstly, they provide...
Jim?
Well, let's try a little thought experiment here. Suppose tomorrow Boeing went out of business and Mitsubishi Heavy became the leading aircraft manufacturer in the country, and they decided to open up a plant in St. Louis or something to do some local content, and they bought a lot of real estate in New York. Would we be better off in that situation? I mean,
suppose Mitsubishi made far better airplanes than Boeing, which is where we have to begin. Okay? Then I think it would be a difficult calculation, because we would not forget that we were getting the great advantage of superior aircraft.
Let me add this, though. Through these real estate investment, most of the companies lost money.
Sure.
In other words, the wealth was transferred from Japan to the United States. Most of the insurance companies invested in treasury bills in this country in the past 3 years lost the money, meaning transfer of wealth from Japan to the United States. Lobbyists being paid. Mr. Choate being paid by Japanese. That's transfer of wealth from Japan to the United States.
But where this comes out, the bottom line is that both of you feel that only at the point when the United States and American companies can produce goods and services that are as good as Japanese, only then do you get the equilibrium, and no changes in rules. In your case, no changes in rules will get us from one place to the other.
I don't want to leave you the impression that I think everything is okay. But as I said, I think the real changes have to be made in Japan itself. I think Japanese doing business in the United States subject to our rules and our laws are fine. And I think we should encourage them. But I think it's looking at what goes on in Japan and how difficult it is for Americans to penetrate their market that we have to use a lot of our political...
That I guess everybody agrees on.
We all do that, but it seems
I certainly agree with Robert on that diagnosis. My prescription is somewhat different, because for hundreds of years, foreigners have been trying to convert Japan in one way or another, religiously, politically, economically, and there is precious little evidence of success in this venture. So it seems to me foolish to have a policy that depends on missionary efforts within Japan to bring them to our legal standards.
I look at the evidence as very different from Jim. I think that, in fact, what we're seeing as a result of the Structural Impediments Initiative are changes. They're not taking place as quickly as we would like, but I think that there are major changes taking place in Japan, and I think they're occurring because the Japanese today realize if they want to play a major global role, they themselves have to be a more open economy. It's because it's in Japan's interest, and that's what the Japanese are best at doing, actions that are in their interest.
Well, I will leave it there. Thank you all for watching, and thank you for being our guests. I'm going to say goodbye now to Robert Lawrence of Harvard University, and Jim Fallows from Atlantic Monthly, and Dr. Kichi Mochizuki. Thank you for being here. And I'm Robert Krulwich for Frontline.
Funding for Frontline is provided by the financial support of viewers like you and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. For video cassette information about this program, please call this toll-free number, 1-800-328-PBS-1.
This is PBS.
For a printed transcript of this or any Frontline program, send $5 to Journal Graphics Incorporated, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. To order by credit card, call 303-831-9000.